You're having the worst day of your life. Maybe you just got dumped. Maybe your boss humiliated you in front of the whole office. Maybe someone called with news you weren't ready for, and now you're sitting on the couch at 2 in the afternoon with your shoes still on, staring at nothing. And then, before you've said a single word, your dog gets up from across the room, walks directly to you, and puts his head in your lap. You didn't call him. You didn't cry out loud. You barely moved. He just knew. Now, the obvious thing to do here is feel warm about that for a second and move on. File it under "dogs are great" and go back to your day. That is, honestly, what most people do. And it's also completely wrong. Not because the warmth isn't real, but because what just happened in that room is one of the most structurally serious questions in modern neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and the philosophy of consciousness. It just happens to also be very cute. Here's the assumption that needs to go: that this question belongs on a decorative pillow next to a golden retriever. That asking whether animals genuinely detect human sadness is a soft question, a sentimental one. The kind of thing you discuss over herbal tea and then never think about again. It isn't. What your dog just did, crossing a room unprompted, reading a situation with no verbal cues, calibrating his response to your specific emotional state, is a behavior that took 15,000 years of coevolution to build. 15,000 years of humans and dogs living in such close proximity that dogs didn't just learn to tolerate us. They developed dedicated neural architecture for reading our faces. They evolved olfactory sensitivity so precise that they can detect the biochemical signature of your stress in the air of a room. They built, inside their own nervous systems, something that functions measurably, verifiably, in controlled laboratory conditions, like empathy. That's not a metaphor, that's a mechanism. And the reason most people don't know this isn't because the science is new. It's because for most of the 20th century, the scientific establishment had a firm and confident answer to the question of whether animals have inner emotional lives. And that answer was no. Animals were stimulus response machines. Behavior was behavior. What looked like grief was just behavior. What looked like joy was just behavior. What looked like your dog knowing you were falling apart before you'd admitted it to yourself, also just behavior. Very measurable, very clean, very convenient for everyone who didn't want to think too hard about what was actually happening. The only problem was the animals. They kept doing things that didn't fit. The dominant view in biology, for most of the 20th century, was something called behaviorism. The idea that animals were essentially biological machines. Input, output, repeat. You could study what they did. You could not, under any circumstances, claim to know what they felt. Feelings were unscientific. Feelings were projection. Feelings were what people who hadn't read enough B.F. Skinner did. Science, bless its cautious little heart, needed roughly a century of careful observation, controlled studies, and a lot of heated conference debates before it was willing to commit anything else to paper. The problem started in the field, not the lab, the actual field. Jane Goodall was watching chimpanzees in Gombe in the 1960s when she observed a young male named Flint lose his mother. Flint stopped eating. He stopped moving much. He sat near the place where she had died, and within a month, he died too. Of what, exactly, is technically an open question, but his body was healthy, and he was devastated. Goodall wrote it down, published it, and was promptly told by multiple senior researchers that she was anthropomorphizing, projecting human emotions onto an animal that was simply exhibiting stress-related behavioral withdrawal. Which, sure, that is one way to describe it. It's also a very clinical way to describe grief. And it wasn't just chimpanzees. Elephants were returning to the bones of dead family members, running their trunks along the skulls with what every observer on the ground described as deliberate, careful attention. Dolphins were carrying dead calves at the surface of the water for days. Crows were holding what researchers, carefully, reluctantly, started calling funeral gatherings around dead members of their group. The behaviorist model kept explaining these things away, and the animals kept doing them anyway, with a consistency that was starting to become embarrassing for the model. The shift, when it finally came, wasn't a single study. It was an accumulation. By the time neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp published his work on the emotional systems of the mammalian brain in the 1990s, the architecture was already there to support a different conclusion, that the limbic system, the brain's emotional core, isn't a human invention. It's ancient. It predates language. It predates civilization. It predates us by hundreds of millions of years, present across virtually every mammal on the planet, and traceable, in modified forms, into birds and fish. Emotion isn't something evolution gave to humans as a special gift. It's a survival tool, old, shared, and running in the background of almost every warm-blooded creature you've ever seen. Which means the question about your dog on the couch just got considerably larger. Here's where it stops being philosophy and starts being anatomy. Your dog's nose contains roughly 300 million olfactory receptors. Yours contains about 6 million. That gap isn't like comparing a good swimmer to an excellent swimmer. It's closer to comparing someone who can see a lit candle across a room to someone who can detect that same candle from 17 kilometers away on a clear night. Same species of information. Completely different universe of sensitivity. And what your dog is smelling when you're falling apart is specific. When you're stressed or grieving, your body releases cortisol and adrenaline. Your skin chemistry shifts. Your breath changes composition. These aren't subtle signals. They're a full broadcast, and your dog is receiving every frequency of it simultaneously before you've registered the feeling yourself in any conscious way. In 2022, researchers at Queen's University Belfast trained dogs to distinguish between breath and sweat samples taken from people before and after a stressful task. The dogs identified the stress samples with an accuracy of over 93%, not a rough guess, not a tendency. 93% in controlled conditions from cotton swabs. That is not a party trick. That is a diagnostic tool. But smell is only one piece of this, and honestly the piece that gets the most attention because the numbers are so dramatic. The cognitive layer is where it gets genuinely strange. In 2015, researchers at the University of Vienna showed dogs photographs of human faces, happy expressions, angry expressions, and tracked where the dog's eyes went first. Dogs showed what's called a left gaze bias when reading human emotional expressions. They look to the left side of a face, which is the side that most reliably displays genuine emotion in humans. Here's the thing, humans do this too, when reading other human faces. It's a specific cognitive adaptation for decoding emotional authenticity. Dogs didn't develop it for reading other dogs. They developed it for reading us. Evolution doesn't send newsletters. It just quietly rewires whatever works. So across 15,000 years of living alongside humans, dogs didn't merely learn to tolerate our moods. They built dedicated neural machinery for parsing our faces, reading our biochemistry, and calibrating their responses to our specific emotional states. The dog on your couch isn't running a general human seems upset subroutine. He's reading you, your face, your smell, your particular version of a bad day. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Anyway, which brings up a question nobody in the dog cognition field can quite agree on. Is any of this unique to dogs, or did we just study dogs first because they were convenient? Dogs were convenient. They've lived with us for 15,000 years. They're everywhere, and they have an obvious, visible relationship with human emotional states that even the most committed behaviorist had trouble fully dismissing. So yes, we studied them first, and we studied them most. But the moment researchers started asking the same questions about other species, things got strange in a different direction entirely. Cats, for instance, have a reputation for not caring. This is not entirely unfair. But what researchers at Oakland University found in 2019 is that cats don't respond to human emotional states in general. They respond to their specific human's emotional states, and they do it differently depending on the person. A cat that has lived with you for 3 years has built an individualized emotional model of you, your baseline, your tells, your particular version of distress. It isn't reading human sadness, it's reading your sadness. That's a meaningfully different thing, and it's honestly a little unsettling when you sit with it. Horses go further. Researchers at the University of Sussex showed horses photographs of human faces, angry and happy, and then, hours later, introduced them to a neutral stranger whose expression matched the one in the photo. The horses that had seen the angry face treated the neutral stranger with measurably more wariness. They had encoded an emotional memory from a photograph, carried it across time, and applied it to a living person they had never met. A photograph. Hours later. Different individual. That is not a reflex. That is not a conditioned response. That is something that looks unsettlingly close to anticipatory social reasoning. And then there are elephants, which is where the cross-species piece enters, and the whole thing quietly expands past anything you were expecting. Elephants have been observed responding to the distress calls of other species, not just their own. They approach, they touch, they stay. In 2014, a study published in Peer J documented elephants consoling distressed members of their group through physical contact and soft vocalizations, in patterns that mapped almost exactly onto what human consolation behavior looks like structurally. The behavior wasn't triggered by threat. It was triggered by another elephant's emotional state alone. Now here's the part that reframed everything for me personally. In a study out of Johns Hopkins, researchers staged a scenario where a person was trapped behind a door, making sounds of distress. Dogs on the other side could open the door. Most of them did. But the ones that opened it fastest weren't the most excitable dogs. They were the ones that had first paused, slowed their own breathing, and appeared to calm themselves down before acting. They regulated their own emotional state in order to be more useful to you. That is not instinct wearing a costume. Notice what none of these animals do. They don't tell you it's going to be okay. They don't reframe the situation. They don't offer perspective or silver linings or the name of a therapist they've heard good things about. They don't need the problem to resolve before they can be present with you. They don't check their phone while you're crying. They don't get uncomfortable with the silence and fill it with noise just to make themselves feel better about witnessing your pain. They just stay. And I want to be careful here because this is the part where it's tempting to turn that into a lesson about humans, to say that animals are better at this than we are, that we should all be more like the dog. That's not what the evidence actually shows, and it's a little too tidy to be true. What the evidence shows is something stranger and harder to categorize, that the response of staying, of orienting your body toward a distressed creature and remaining there, is not uniquely human. It is, if anything, more ancient than us. The neurochemical picture supports this. When a dog approaches a distressed human, both the dog's oxytocin levels and the human's rise measurably. Oxytocin is the same neurochemical involved in human bonding, trust, and social attachment. The dog isn't performing comfort. Something is happening in both nervous systems simultaneously, in the same chemical language, across two completely different species. Now, and this is the honest part, we cannot verify what it feels like from the inside. Subjective experience is the hardest thing in the universe to confirm from the outside. You cannot scan a dog's brain and find the felt quality of concern. You cannot run a study that proves an elephant is genuinely moved by another creature's suffering, rather than simply executing a behavioral pattern that resembles being moved. This is genuinely philosophically hard, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But here's the counter-argument that keeps nagging at me. When something uses the same neural structures as empathy, produces the same neurochemical cascade as empathy, responds selectively to emotional distress the way empathy responds, and does so consistently across thousands of controlled observations in multiple species, at some point, the burden of proof shifts. You're no longer explaining why this might be empathy. You're explaining why, despite everything, it somehow isn't. That's a much harder argument to make. And science, to its credit, has largely stopped trying. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed in 2012 by a group of prominent neuroscientists, stated plainly that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates for conscious emotional states. They didn't hedge much. A dog sitting with you in the dark, breathing slowly, not going anywhere, that's the same declaration, made without words, made every single day. So let's just say it plainly. Dogs detect human emotional distress through dedicated olfactory and facial recognition systems that evolved specifically for reading us, not animals in general, not the environment, us. And they respond to it with behaviors that involve measurable neurochemical changes in both parties. Cats build individualized emotional profiles of their specific person and respond to deviations from that person's baseline, not to human sadness as a general category. Horses encode emotional information from photographs and carry it forward in time, applying it to strangers hours later. Elephants extend consolation behavior across species lines, to creatures they have no evolutionary reason to comfort. And dogs, when faced with a distressed human behind a closed door, regulate their own internal emotional state before acting, not because they were trained to, but because something in them understood that being calmer would make them more useful to you. That's the answer. Across species, across mechanisms, across decades of research that the field spent a surprisingly long time resisting. Yes, they know. Not the way you know, with language and narrative and the ability to text someone about it at midnight, but with something older than language, running on hardware that predates every civilization you learned about in school, routed through neural structures that your brain and a dog's brain and an elephant's brain all share because they all came from the same ancient biological blueprint. The knowing is real. It just doesn't look the way we expected knowing to look. And here's the thing about that couch. The one from the beginning of this, you, shoes still on, staring at nothing, the worst afternoon of your life arranged around you like furniture. Your dog got up from across the room before you made a sound. He crossed the floor. He read your cortisol in your face and your particular silence, processed it through 300 million receptors and a set of neural adaptations 15,000 years in the making, regulated his own nervous system, and put his head in your lap. He didn't fix it. He didn't try to. He just stayed. And if you've ever had a day like that, and you have, everyone has, you already know what that feels like from the inside. The weight of the head, the warmth, the fact that something alive chose to be next to you specifically, in that specific moment, without being asked and without needing anything back. Science now has a very long, very carefully documented explanation for why that happened. But you knew it meant something before any of that. You knew it the second he walked over. Turns out, he knew it too.